I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about both individual and organizational competencies that are required to be successful at software quality assurance. These competencies include at least the following: leadership skills, team skills, systems thinking, ethics, and you see in parentheses I've said other liabilities. There's much that's connected to that topic. And then lastly, sharing knowledge. That's kind of a key competency at an individual and organizational basis to improve quality. First, let's look at the leadership skills. Quality assurance professionals and managers are leaders. They often don't think about themselves in that way, but doing so is essential to achieving software quality. There's organizational leadership, where software quality professionals are actually leading change. How can we get higher quality? How can we get a developer to actually make changes in their code? How can we get a project manager to allow more time for more testing? How can we convince management that more testing and more quality are going to come as a result of that? We draw upon our abilities to motivate and influence others, and often act as coaches or mentors to developers or project managers about what's required to achieve successful quality. There are also team skills, where often we're called upon to facilitate a meeting or a discussion about a defect, about an error-prone module, or a code inspection or design review, and certainly to communicate the results. Now, in and of itself, IT and software professionals are not known as great communicators, so this is a particularly important competency to be good at. It makes no sense to actually talk about leadership unless we have a definition. Here's one that I like. This comes from the Center for Creative Leadership, actually, and they define leadership as the collective capacity of all members of an organization to accomplish such critical tasks as setting direction, creating alignment, and gaining commitment. Now, you'll notice that those are some of the things I've said previously, indirectly, about what's required to achieve quality. We set it out as a goal, as a key attribute of success. We focus on how we can improve that by looking at different ways to innovate within the context of a project. That's quality leadership. We also have to reflect that certain organizations can only achieve certain things. The term I used previously was capability maturity model, or we could talk about organizational maturity or patterns. Here's a couple of patterns that we often see in organizations, and if you're not at the right place in one of these patterns, you're not going to get very far in your efforts to improve quality. The first is people in the organization don't know that they're actually performing a process. They work often in drawing upon heroic methods to achieve their overall result. Things are the way they are because they got that way. They're actually what we might call an oblivious organization. The second maturity level is do whatever you feel like at the moment, and this is often a classic level. If you can convince a developer to improve their code, they might do so in the moment. But if you want them to improve their programming practice, it might be harder to achieve. We call organizations at this level the variable organization. In the third pattern, organizations follow routines except when they panic. So we actually might have a software development lifecycle, SDLC, that we follow. There actually might be program management practices that are practiced by the organization. We actually may have good testing that's also done as a result of our efforts to achieve quality, except when we discover a crisis or a disaster. We throw all that to the wind. We call such an organization a routine organization. They practice routines. The fourth pattern is where the organization chooses among the routines they use to get the results that they want to produce. This is a more mature organization, one that actually has a good sense of what processes and what practices lead to results for them. This is one that's sharp and savvy and understands how quality is achieved from their efforts and what to do about it when they're not realizing it. We call this kind of organization a steering organization. The fifth pattern is one that establishes their routines based upon their past experience with them. This kind of organization actually keeps a history of its success. It knows from project to project what practices and techniques have worked, which ones don't. It knows how its people perform in different circumstances and can adjust accordingly to the demands of a particular project or quality level. We call this kind of organization an anticipating organization, one that can anticipate what the outcomes are of the practices that they follow. And lastly, at the sixth level of maturity is the kind of organization where everyone is involved in improving everything all the time. This organization is highly focused on achieving both extraordinary levels of productivity and extraordinary levels of quality. They understand the practices and processes. Their people are committed to do so. This is a marvelous place to work, actually. The practices are what we call congruent. This organization is a congruent organization. How do we know that we're in such an organization? There is actually a language of maturity. Here's a couple of different ways to understand that. At level 1, as I mentioned before, the organization is oblivious. It's very individualistic. People just code and deny that they're doing so when, in fact, expectations are that they follow a process. In the variable organization, people don't use words in a consistent way. They don't know how to count problems and factors and issues. They're not very quantitative about the defects that they face. They don't use those terms and concepts that I spoke about earlier. In the routine organization, they use imprecise words. They use some common and useful definitions to things, but they're not pervasive. The statistics they draw upon are usually bad. They're poorly conceived. They're not very statistical, in fact. And they don't practice systems thinking. They're linear thinkers, not understanding the dynamic and complex relationships of all of the variables. A steering organization uses words with precision, and they debate measurements. They do so honestly and robustly, caring for each other. It's not a fight or an argument, but it's a well-focused and directed effort to improve. An anticipating organization has processes and measures that give them stability, and they speak a language around those. They understand how defects are associated with particular processes, and they reflect certain measures they actually expect to have. And they're future-oriented. By that I mean they have the ability to look at a current process and understand what a future change is going to be that will result in a specific intended improvement. How does this look in terms of culture? There are cultural artifacts, what we might call rituals, stories, humor, and physical arrangements of things that reflect the culture of an organization. What does a culture of quality look like? It looks like various aspects of people being able to speak up and talk about quality, or the other side of it, error-prone modules or defects that they might face. They might, for instance, have an award that they share for the developer that produced the code with the most defects, or on the other hand, a reward or recognition that they share for those that produce with the least defects. They will have formal practices and organizational structure, for instance, positions, staff, testers, and a quality organization, perhaps a director of quality assurance. They'll have tasks and technology, QA check, reviews, inspections, and perhaps software systems that help them achieve their goals. And they certainly have rules, procedures, and controls in place to achieve their quality goals. They'll also have informal practices, norms and social rules, for instance. You don't release any code until it's been checked. These are often not written down, but nevertheless are deeply held values and beliefs about how the organization will want to work. And you might also have specific content themes, beliefs, assumptions, and values that are not directly related to quality but help ensure a quality outcome. For instance, a company may want to represent itself, its vision of itself is it produces or provides a quality product or service. That then is used to support the overall culture of quality that we would want to have in order to produce a quality product. Now, what are some challenges? As we look at some competencies, sometimes I'm going to share examples of what we want people to be, and sometimes I'm going to have an example of what we don't want people to be. This is one of the latter. Often, as we're trying to implement better quality practices, we'll run into a term or a concept of a person we could call a concrete head. That means that we can't influence them. Remember my earlier discussion about how do we achieve innovation or get new ideas introduced? A person with a concrete head is not open to new ideas. They're the most serious obstacle to any new implementation or a concept or an idea. Often, because in an organization you can't directly say, oh, I'm not for quality, right? Who would say that? They have a behavior that looks like this. They talk the talk, might use some words, but